I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. We are used to thinking of pleasure as a good thing. Philosophies like utilitarianism even make it the ultimate human good. And the so-called pleasure principle is often the endpoint of explaining why we act in the way that we do. But what if pleasure could be turned around and used as an instrument of societal and philosophical torture? This is the terrifying idea explored in Aldous Huxley's phenomenal novel, Brave New World. It frequently makes the top 10 list for the greatest books of the 20th century, and a close reading uncovers a philosophical depth unmatched by almost any other dystopian novel. Because whereas other visions of fictional totalitarianism focus on the suffering caused by state repression, in Brave New World, almost everyone is happy. They live in a hedonistic paradise, and yet they are permanently cut off from any sort of emotional or philosophical depth. Almost every citizen lives in shallow contentment, drugs staving off any lingering suffering. And yet, a few souls choose to rebel. Get ready to learn if there are things more important than happiness, how gratitude can become perverse, and how we too may have become a bit like Huxley's tranquilized citizens. As always, bear in mind that this is just my interpretation of Brave New World, and there is so much I will not be able to talk about here. But let's begin with a synopsis of the novel and give an overview of the society of this new world, as this will be important context for the rest of the video. From this point on, spoilers abound, so be warned. But before we dive into that, I'd like to give a quick thank you to our very kind sponsor, Shortform. If you like my channel, then chances are you are a fan of books. But there is one problem. There are so many books and so little time in which to read them. But this is where Shortform comes in handy. Shortform contains detailed summaries and analyses of a whole host of different books, from psychology to philosophy to great works of literature. You can keep track of some of the key ideas and best insights from some of the coolest books in the world. Personally, I enjoy using Shortform to scope out books I might want to read in the future, and for refreshing my memory on books that I've already read. As a personal recommendation, I would advise first reading the summary of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It is a fantastic way of reminding yourself of some of his key insights, or learning them for the first time. By joining through my link in the description, shortform.com/Joseph, you'll get a free trial and a 20% discount on an annual subscription. So, give it a try. You've got nothing to lose and knowledge to gain. 1. A Brave New Overview. Like almost all dystopian novels, the setting of Brave New World is perhaps the most important character in the story, and the relationship our protagonists have with the world itself shapes them just as much as their interactions with one another, if not far more so. Brave New World is set in a post-war version of Earth, where a global government has taken over, run by 10 governors who bear the rather appropriate title, Controller. And the policies of this world state are entirely centered around stability and pleasure. This dictates almost every decision the controllers make, from their legislation around birth to their extensive drug program to the culture of the planet. And their work begins at conception. The citizens of this new world are all artificially created by the state from eggs and sperm inside a hatchery. And even at this point, the fate of every single person is sealed. They are immediately separated into classes ranging from Alpha Plus to Epsilon, and which letter they bear will dictate their entire lives. From the education they receive to the jobs they will have to their social position, all of it is determined from this moment. The Alpha Pluses will be the future scientists, leaders, and venerated achievers of the world, while the Deltas and the Epsilons will be stuck with menial tasks. Depending on which class an embryo belongs to, it is either given an ideal environment for nourishing its future physical and psychological development, or it is purposefully stunted with the application of alcohol and other solutions designed to hamper their intellect and body later in life. The idea here is that not only will an Epsilon not be able to do an Alpha Plus job, but they would not even want to. Once children are born, they are raised by the state, and the concept of mothers and fathers is totally forbidden. Every child is the government's child, and each little one is psychologically conditioned to hold certain beliefs about culture, society, and the other classes. Alphas are taught to look down on the deltas and epsilons, while deltas and epsilons are taught to venerate the alphas, but only ever at a distance. This is also where the core principles of the culture of the state are conditioned. The tenets of unrestricted lovemaking, total emotional uninvestment in other people, and the absolute, unquestionable authority of the world controllers are all hammered into these infant skulls through thousands of repetitions. Once they are grown, happiness drugs, named Soma, are available on demand. And anyone who feels sad or upset is encouraged to take some Soma to restore their former peace of mind. Misery is extremely frowned upon, and the idea of understanding empathy is seen as outdated. The only response anyone has to another's sadness is take a Soma. The story of Brave New World follows Lenina Crown, Bernard Marx, and Helmholtz Watson as they deal with the arrival of John the Savage, someone who was born outside of the world state. The plot begins in earnest when Bernard takes Lenina on holiday to a savage reservation. These reservations are the few places in the world left unconquered by the world state, and they live in small tribal communities. There, Bernard meets John, who will later be given the unflattering name John Savage, and his mother, Linda, who was a citizen of the world state mistakenly left behind on a previous expedition. Because his mother was originally from the world state, John has always been an outcast in the reservation, and Bernard agrees to take both him and his mother back to see this great civilization John had always heard about. At first, this works out wonderfully. Bernard gets a lot of social status for having found this unique anomaly, and John explores the world. Bernard is a psychologist, and he is fascinated by the way John's mind works so differently from having been raised outside the state. He also introduces John to both Helmholtz and Lenina. Helmholtz works in the government's propaganda wing, but he harbours a deep and treasonous fascination with what art could be, if it was allowed to be created through a free expression of human passion. And John's chaotic experiences on the reservation, as well as his knowledge of the banned works of Shakespeare, strike Helmholtz as incredible. Meanwhile, Lenina is very attracted to John. The feeling is mutual, but John has not been raised with the principles of total free love, where sex is basically the same thing as high-fiving. So he understandably feels threatened by Lenina's braggadocious advances, and eventually chases her away. Linda, John's mother, decides to spend the rest of her life in a drug-fueled, semi-comatose state in one of the government hospitals, which everyone is broadly approving of, apart from John, who thinks that such artificial happiness is abhorrent. However, soon the drugs overtake Linda's system and her lungs begin to fail. John rushes to her bedside, weeping, but his grief, coupled with his repeated insistence that she is his mother and that he loves her, causes a public scandal. Everyone in the world state is conditioned to think of death as a pretty unremarkable event, and to think of natural birth as both morally abhorrent and disgusting. Children are given tours around the dying in order to death condition them, and when someone is no longer useful to the state, they are not considered to have that much value anyway. John's erratic behaviour and natural displays of grief are considered socially disruptive, and he, Bernard, and Helmholtz are all hauled up in front of Mustafa Mond, one of the 10 world controllers. Here, Mustafa and John engage in a fascinating philosophical dialogue over the value of different aspects of human experience. And trust me, we are going to go into detail about this later. Mustafa sends Bernard and Helmholtz away to one of the many islands the state sends people with enough original thought to be considered dangerous, while he allows John to go free. Bernard is horrified at the thought of exile, but Mustafa almost envies him. Apparently, these exiled islands are not too bad, and are also full of the most interesting people left on the planet. In fact, those considered so interesting that they are a social disruption. Having been released back into society, John sets up shop in a lighthouse and wishes to serve as a living counterpoint to the hedonistic values of the new world. He engages in self-flagellation and becomes deliberately primitive, eschewing any sign of the civilization he so hates. However, soon people begin to show up at his retreat in order to watch this modern Diogenes. He is a curiosity, and people will not leave him alone. Robbed of even the small respite of solitude, John ends his own life. This could have been a last act of rebellion, or of despair, or of torment. But either way, the man from the wilderness who was the only living person who could serve as a true counterexample to the world state is dead. And the brave new world continues. It is unchanged and unchallenged, and may roll on indefinitely, propelled by the weight of its own inertia. It is a fascinating story, and it contains such a host of ideas, questions, and criticisms that we are spoiled for choice on where to start. But I want to begin by examining the underlying philosophy of the controllers, social cohesion above all else, and the interesting and unintuitive philosophical consequences of this approach. 2. Alone in public. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer lived most of his life in marked solitude. Women seemed to find him repulsive, he had few friends, and his philosophy found almost no admirers until the very end of his life. And despite all of this loneliness, he learnt to value solitude incredibly highly, because he thought it was the only time someone is truly free to be themselves. In public, there are always the constraints of others' expectations, threatening to crush whatever nascent individuality we have. But in long stretches alone, we can come to know and create who we are. If we spend our entire lives with others, then that is fine, but we will inevitably stifle whatever could have been truly unique about us. And this is a theme that echoes through a number of 19th century existential philosophers. Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche were also very worried about the impact of the crowd or the herd on others. No one person can stand against the immense power and momentum of an entire public, so if they do not wish to be devoured, then they must find some solace in solitude. Nietzsche implores people to symbolically climb the mountain alone, so that they can grow their individuality and not just become another limb of the eldritch crowds that dominate the social sphere. But for the government of Brave New World, no philosophy could be more destructive or harmful than this. One of the main lessons the citizenry are indoctrinated with is everyone belongs to everyone else. Enjoying solitude is considered a strange and disgusting quirk, a bit like how we might view someone who drinks their own wee. And the idea behind this is simple. The world controllers agree with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. They know that solitude can cultivate individuality, but they associate this individuality with unacceptable danger. After all, with difference in thought might come difference in action, and with difference in action might come social conflict and upheaval. How could they tolerate the possibility of a thinker like Nietzsche or Kierkegaard in a world where stability is prized above everything else? The very notion of a revolutionary idea or a revolutionary thinker is destabilizing, and why should we care about them anyway? I mean, if everyone is broadly happy, then what's the point of the individual? Why should we infect a perfectly happy society full of blissful clones with a corrupting notion of uniqueness or individuality? What possible use could they have for it? And I think we should take the position of the world state seriously here. Most of the time, when we ask whether something is worthwhile or not, many of us tend to judge it according to whether it promotes human well-being. So ending world hunger would be a good thing, and massacring puppies would be a bad thing. This is often the line of argument people use to support the notion of existential individuality as well. According to them, any attempt to kill the individual inside of us will leave us feeling empty and unfulfilled. We may try to assimilate into a crowd or a public identity, but there will always be this gnawing sense that we have betrayed ourselves, that we are living a half-life. The thing that makes Brave New World so fascinating is that this argument arguably no longer applies. We aren't presented with any evidence that the notion of individuality will make anyone in the world state happier. If anything, it might make them less so. At the moment, they feel no need to be individuals. They are content in their class positions and have a life which gives them more hedonistic pleasure than any of us will ever get. But all the same, it strikes us that something is missing. The loss of the individual seems like a great tragedy even when no one is suffering from it. But can we justify this position? Does it make sense to value the flourishing of individuals as good for its own sake? Or is this something that, in theory, we should sacrifice for the greater good? The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle thought that the ultimate human good was eudaimonia, or flourishing. This was a pleasant and fulfilled state that someone achieved when they were truly living in accordance with both reason and virtue. It is a kind of individual fullness that arises from cultivating our virtues and obeying our duties to others, to ourselves, and to the gods. This is in contrast to utilitarian philosophy, which valued maximizing human happiness above all else. In Brave New World, we see these philosophies battle it out over the value of us as unique persons. For Aristotle, being happy is all well and good, but it is human development, human virtue that really matters. And importantly, this sometimes requires struggle and pain. We cannot be brave if there is no such thing as danger, and we cannot be magnanimous if we aren't allowed to form attachments to others. Without private action and individuality, eudaimonia becomes impossible. Even in Aristotle's extensive list of duties that we owe to other people, the thing that makes them virtuous is that they are given without compulsion. In Brave New World, all of this complexity in ethics and in character is flattened into maximizing pleasure. But there is a real question of whether this is a sufficient justification for abolishing our idiosyncratic usness. Brave New World is hardly the only dystopian novel to tackle this concept of abolishing the individual. It comes up in 1984 and even The Hunger Games. It is pretty commonplace for a dystopia to rob people of what makes them quintessentially them and absorb every individual person into a wider idea of the public. But what makes Brave New World so brilliant is that at a glance, this loss of uniqueness appears to have made everyone happier. Whereas you could look at 1984 and say obviously a lack of individuality is part of the reason the citizens are suffering. In Huxley's novel, they are not suffering, and we have to ask the genuine question of whether uniqueness is worth a loss in pleasure. Would we rather be us or some happier person who is near identical to a billion other happy people? Where other dystopian fiction defends individuality on utilitarian grounds, Huxley strikes at the very first premise of utilitarianism by presenting us with a situation where we have given up our individuality for extra happiness. And now we must ask whether it was worth it. This is just the first example of perhaps the most interesting philosophical question Huxley poses in the novel. What, if anything, is more important to us than feeling good? Get used to this question, as it's going to be a major theme throughout the video. And while the topic of individuality poses this question in the existential sphere, our next topic poses it in the political one. 3. Plato, class, and gratitude. In Plato's Republic, the old philosopher has a very similar quest as the world controllers do in Brave New World. He wants to create a society that is stable and just. And he also divides the state into different classes to achieve this. For Plato, there is the bronze class, the silver class, and the gold class. The bronze class would be the industry of the city, the silver class would form its military, and the gold class would be his infamous philosopher kings who ruled from on high. And Plato also wanted his lower bronze class citizens to enjoy their roles. He said they would never want to be silver or gold anyway, and that this was the best place for them, the place where they would be happiest. In Huxley's world, this Platonic idea has been taken to the extreme. As I said before, there is a rigid biological class system based on the nourishment someone receives as an embryo. And as soon as this is done, each class is conditioned to know and love their place. The deltas and epsilons are made deliberately unintelligent by the interventions of the hatchery, and they are conditioned over their entire education to love their work. At one point, an alpha remarks that if they were given much more to do than simple busy work, they would be miserable, just like if an alpha was given an epsilon job. They are essentially made grateful for their position via their conditioning. And the alpha admits that if he was born an epsilon, he would be conditioned to not want to be anything else. From a purely utilitarian standpoint, this can seem great in a perverse way. The psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi once argued that us humans are at our most joyous when we are occupied by a task that we find meaningful and pushes our abilities without overwhelming them. Ideally, the careful interventions of the hatchery means that everyone's job does just that. There is no room for social mobility, but there is no wish for it either. If the epsilons are made content with their socially devalued and exploited position, then who would we be to stop them? Are we going to inflict upon them knowledge that would only make them unhappy and that they would not know what to do with anyway? In our world, such arguments are quite rightly viewed as very condescending and misplaced. But that is partly because in our world, almost everyone can learn new things and become much more knowledgeable, skillful, and intelligent than they already are. Even the most ardent and extreme believers on fixed limits on intelligence do not think that people cannot learn or grow. But in Huxley's world, there truly is no possibility of growth for the deltas or epsilons, which complicates the ethical question. And this is also a much more extreme form of elitism even than Plato's. At least Plato allowed for social mobility in theory, whereas in Brave New World, it is a biological impossibility. As we move into the mid-21st century and start to explore ways to edit the genetic makeup of embryos, some people have worried about this biological hierarchy becoming a reality. So, we are presented with a society that is, at the same time, extremely unequal and also perversely meritocratic. Everyone ends up where they can perform to the best of their abilities, but at the same time, this is predetermined from birth. The potential of the majority of the population is deliberately stunted, and they are made to enjoy this. Again, we see the challenge to the first principles of utilitarianism. This may be a happy situation, but does it not seem somehow grotesque? Is our moral intuition not screaming at us that this situation is unjust not by virtue of its consequences, but by its very form? Is robbing someone of their potential and making them thank you for it wrong, even if that is technically what will make that person happiest? Or is this kneecapping of someone's development not respecting their dignity as a rational agent? Certainly, this is the kind of thing that Jeremy Bentham and Kant would have a bar fight about. If we combine Huxley with some contemporary philosophy, then the questions become even more interesting. Peter van Inwagen and Robert Sapolsky are just the latest in a long line of determinists. People who think that the outcomes of our lives and even the choices that we make are predetermined and thus outside of our control. Sapolsky points out that the income levels of our parents, our education, and the country we are born in all have disproportionate effects on not just where we will end up later in life, but also the kind of choices that we will make. If we experience certain types of childhood trauma, then we are more likely to make decisions based in anger. And if we have a family history of addiction, we are much more likely to become addicts ourselves. All of these have an effect on our lives, but they are also fundamentally out of our control. We do not choose our genetics or our upbringing, or really our education until the higher levels. And there are also examples of this that are so obvious we don't even register them on a day-to-day basis. If you are born attractive, then you have innumerable advantages in your career, relationships, and more. If you are born with a debilitating illness, this can severely limit your options in life. And none of this is even remotely up to us. Perhaps the scariest part of Huxley's determinist class system is that it is an exaggerated and agential version of something the universe arguably already does to us. As a child, we did not control how we were raised, or our genetics, or our social environment, or even our nutrition. And yet this is a huge determinant of where we will end up later in life, and what we will choose to do later in life. For instance, if we were part of the generation whose mothers took thalidomide to help with morning sickness, then we might have been born with its associated syndrome and had our physical growth impaired considerably. A huge swathe of our options in life cut off in an instant, through no choice of our own. Sure, we notice the extreme effects of this particular example, but if the determinists are right, then structurally our situation is no different. We may not live in the profoundly unfree system of Huxley's world, but we don't often acknowledge the ways in which our own universe is doing the work of the hatchery directors for them. And you don't even need to be an outright determinist to recognize this. And in some ways, Huxley's world even has an advantage over our own. At least they can recognize all of the aspects of their lives that are out of their hands. They can point to the hatcheries and say, look, there, that is why I am what I am. Whereas many of us live with the inherited idea that whatever happens to us is solely the result of our own merits and demerits. Even if you believe that someone is radically responsible for everything that happens in their lives, that does not mean that they have caused it. In Huxley's world, people know what is constraining their choices, but do we know what is constraining ours? Or do we instead pretend we are much freer than we actually are? Just because we don't have 10 global controllers watching over us does not mean that we are the masters of our own fate. To what extent can we truly claim credit for where we are in life? And how much did causal factors outside of our control intercede on our behalf? Or seal our unhappy fate? Such questions lie at the intersection of the debate around free will, ethics, moral responsibility, and much more. Once again, the philosophical depth of Huxley's novel is plain for all to see. But next, I want to look at how the world state has murdered a key human instinct, and one that many of us hold in very high esteem. 4. Creativity and consumption. In one of Franz Kafka's letters, he describes that he and his novels are one and the same. If you want to know him, then read his writings, and if you don't, then the deepest parts of him will be forever closed off to you. It is a characteristically dramatic proclamation for the Bohemian legend, but it also strikes at the heart of something that makes many people's lives truly fulfilling: their ability to create. One of the only books that was available to John while he was growing up on the reservation was the complete works of Shakespeare, which no one in the world state was allowed to read. And when he enters this futuristic society, one of the glaring omissions is great art. He goes to one of the entertainment venues with Lenina to watch a feelie, a kind of all-immersive film. But he is horrified by the shallowness of the art on display. It is all just stock storylines about two-dimensional characters. It does not challenge, nor does it reveal anything. It does not encourage reflection or even pose an interesting question. It is pleasant, but it is never anything more than that. And this causes John immense distress. This frustration about art is shared by the propagandist Helmholtz. Helmholtz desperately wants to create art, but despite being one of the deepest thinkers anyone has come across in the world state, he still cannot summon up anything of depth or insight to write. right. When he encounters the works of Shakespeare through John, he is astounded at the creativity on display. This is what has been missing from his life. But his programming is so entrenched that he can't even fully appreciate it. He can glimpse its beauty, admire its creativity, but its tragedies fall flat, and some of its great moments are rendered unintentionally ridiculous and crude. This saddens John because he realizes that not only has Helmholtz been made unable to create things that are expressive, but the very ability to see and recognize depths of emotion or passion has been totally stolen from him. Most of the spectrum of emotional experience is unexplored territory. And while he is, in a sense, happy, this has come at the cost of hobbling his psyche. And this is meant to be one of the most gifted alpha pluses in Europe, someone everyone recognizes as a genius, a towering intellect. But try as he might, he is impotent to create. This dialogue about art and creativity comes to a head in the conversation between John and Mustafa Mond at the end of the novel. John is bemoaning the state of art in the New World, and Mustafa surprisingly agrees. He says there is nothing that they make or even could make that would compare to Shakespeare. According to him, you cannot have art except by suffering and strife. For Mustafa, extreme creativity can only exist as long as there is war, famine, disease, pain, loss, and grief. But he and the other world controllers have worked very hard to eliminate these. Sure, the quality of art has decreased, but if the whole purpose of art in the first place was to help us cope with an imperfect world, is that so bad? Now, such a world is a thing of the past. There is no need for art. It has outgrown its usefulness. And for Mustafa, this is not a cause for despair, but for bittersweet celebration. Just as the smallpox vaccine has been rendered pretty much obsolete because the horrific disease has been totally eliminated, the controllers have destroyed the suffering that we needed art to treat. No one would say we should bring back smallpox because without it we don't get the smallpox vaccine. For Mustafa, the death of creativity is a small price to pay for a world without pain. And this hits at the core of an age-old philosophical debate about the purpose of creating art. Is it the job of art to produce pleasure in its audience, or does it strike at something that is more important than pleasure? For instance, Plato thought that beauty was good for its own sake. He would quite often talk about the beautiful and the good as if they inevitably went together. And one of the jobs that art does, even in his censorious Republic, is reflect the form of the beautiful. Other thinkers would argue that the world controllers have not eliminated the need for creation. For instance, the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm posits that the act of creating something is partly aimed at dealing with a feeling of separateness. In a moment of creativity, we become unified with our craft. We become one with it while maintaining our individuality. For others, like Kafka, art is partly an expression of something within, a way of communing with the world and with other people, those aspects of ourselves that we cannot put into straightforward words. And this is only scratching the surface of the various different views of art and creation that abound among philosophers. Something we see an awful lot in the diaries and private letters of great creatives is that their works sometimes seem like they are bursting forth from within, causing extreme discomfort if they are not released. The Russian writer and philosopher Fyodor Dostoevsky said that one of the unbearable things about life in his prison camp was his inability to put pen to paper. He was constantly bursting with ideas, and they were screaming at him to be expressed, but his will was frustrated. And many people feel this to some extent. Many of us have a desire to create and to leave a mark on the world by our creation. Nietzsche would have called this a manifestation of the will to power. Ernest Becker would have called it death denial. And Schopenhauer might refer to it as an externalized will to life. So a huge philosophical question dangles in the air. How important do we think this desire to create is? And are we willing to sacrifice it if it's going to bring us more hedonistic pleasure? Are the citizens in Brave New World happy in the greatest sense? Or are they cut off from some of the deeper joys of life because of their inability to exert these inner creative drives? Characteristically of this work, there are endless questions and very few answers. And the issues certainly do not stop there, because now we will move on to something very close to our hearts: the way this utopian dystopia treats love. 5. Love and free love. Some of the greatest stories in history have centered around love and its erstwhile companion, loss. We hear love's frustrations in the declamations of Tristan and Isolde, while Romeo's profession that he ne'er saw true beauty till this night speaks to the way love can well and truly knock us over, turning our lives completely upside down. Love caused the Trojan War, brings joy to billions of people, and Empedocles thought it was one of the fundamental forces of the universe. Suffice to say, It's a big deal. And a huge theme in a lot of philosophy and literature about love is the idea that we want to merge with another person in some way. In the Bible, this is put as becoming one flesh. In Plato's Symposium, lovers are imagined as two halves of the same soul, cut in twain by the gods. In the 20th century, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan spoke of the tension in romance between togetherness and distance. There are the twin wishes to remain independent from our lover and to meld with them. We want to be reassured by the continued presence of another person, yet also to remain independent. And these desires understandably come into conflict. This tension can be seen almost everywhere, from the advice to treat them mean to keep them keen to the third act of almost every single romantic comedy. So it is notable that in Brave New World, the controllers have tried to take this desire from us, to condition us out of it. Instead of this wish to merge with another, there is the maxim that everyone belongs to everyone else, and there is a love that is totally free. And here, free simply means without restriction. Making love is essentially on par with making a cake. Lenina is looked upon as strange for having vaguely monogamous and committal drives. First, she takes up with a man named Henry and stops seeing other people, and then later she forms a unique fascination for John. Her friends look upon this as totally bizarre, as do the rest of the citizens. For them, love and lovemaking is not something you do with someone you care about. Instead, it is all simple recreation, and nothing more. Indeed, the very notion of an emotional, passionate connection, either with a single person or with multiple people, is condemned in the strongest terms. Even the word mother is considered vulgar because of the special connection it implies someone has with their child. I find this very interesting because the view of love the world state ends up taking is at once deeply individualist and also very collectivist. On the one hand, no one can really open themselves up to another person in any meaningful fashion because that would require the dreaded emotional connection. But on the other hand, everyone is free to be courted by anyone else at any time. There is the illusion of freedom, but every choice amounts to the same thing, a shallow connection with someone you are using as a self-pleasure aid. Everyone belongs to everyone else, but everyone is also a consumable object to everyone else. And in a flurry of freedom, the citizens of the New World find they have no choices. Because in what sense is a choice meaningful if its effects are the same as every other one we could have made, with only superficial differences dancing along the surface? Connection has been totally replaced by consumption. The fundamental option that is barred from the New World is that of commitment. No one has the ability to commit to another person. In fact, it would make you a social pariah and possibly get you exiled. But it is only through types of commitments that we get to experience the deeper layers of love, companionship, and more. Don't be fooled into thinking this point is more profound than it is. It is just that if we're going to forge a connection with others, then we need to give that person our time, attention, and affection in a way that is non-transactional and does not treat them as an object for our own pleasure. It is love freely given and freely received, but not free in the sense of Brave New World. There, every romantic interaction is reduced down to pleasure traded for pleasure. There is nothing inherently wrong with this being one dimension of love, but if it is the only dimension, then so much is missed out. The reassurance that someone knows you at a fundamental level, with all of your little insanities and flaws, and loves you nonetheless. The ability to express your vulnerable affection for someone else, safe in the knowledge that it will be well received. According to Aristotle, virtuous friendship and love was the deepest and most fulfilling connection we could forge with any other person. And yet, in Brave New World, people are permanently cut off from this. And this deprivation is made all the more insidious because they are not forced to abandon love at the point of a gun, but instead they are taught that it is something of little importance, and that taking it seriously is a mark of undesirable eccentricity. I cannot help but think of how some of my close friends describe their experiences on dating apps, and see some rather unsettling parallels. This notion of there being so many people out there someone could be with, yet a fundamental inability to commit to anyone in particular, reminds me of something that Kierkegaard talked about in his brilliant book, The Sickness Unto Death. A type of despair brought on by an excess of possibility. And one example of this is when we are paralyzed by options, so that each individual choice to not commit to a single line of action strikes us as totally inconsequential. But then, eventually, our postponement of investment comes back to bite us, and we never engage in the sort of unconditional commitment that might fulfill us. For Kierkegaard, commitment is a leap of faith that we must take to elevate our lives, yet it is always terrifying and, to a certain extent, irrational. But sometimes just committing to something is better than to nothing at all. The citizens of Brave New World are arguably mired in this despair of possibility, and their only mercy is that They don't know what they're missing. However, we have now talked an awful lot about the carefully crafted culture of the world state. It is now time to turn to their enforcement mechanism, and it is a power we are all sadly familiar with. 6. Isolation and shame. If you've been a teenager at some point, then you almost certainly know shame. That creeping feeling that whatever you are doing is either wrong or being constantly judged by your peers. It makes you feel like you are insufficient or defective in some way. After a while, the voice of outer condemnation and the voice of inner shame begin to sing from the same hymn sheet. And you can end up truly believing that you are all of those horrible things that people are saying or insinuating about you. While in many ways the new world functions as a hedonistic paradise, shame is the engine of punishment that keeps everyone in line. This is clearest in the case of Bernard Marx. He is an Alpha Plus, the highest ranking caste in the world state. He's an accomplished psychologist and by all accounts should be having a great time. But he is constantly being shamed, both by other people and by himself. The first source of this is quite literally his stature. Bernard is a few inches shorter than the other Alpha Pluses, and in a world where physical size is praised as a virtue, and when the Alpha Pluses are purposefully made to tower above the lower ranking classes, this is a source of great insecurity for Bernard, and it is something he cannot change in the slightest. He is not content with being a short king, as some people say. I don't know if that term is still relevant. My sister told me about it the other day, but I tend to learn slang terms about 6 months after everyone else stops using them. So let me know if short king is relevant here or if I just seem like an old man. This little touch of alienation is also what leads to his separation from wider society. It is what causes him to stop taking soma and to purposefully feel sorrow as a little act of rebellion against the community that has rejected him. Outwardly, he wants nothing to do with this society, but inwardly, he yearns for its approval. He is like the child desperately trying to get his parents' attention after being ignored for so long. And this inner conflict in Bernard is displayed all throughout the novel. Most notably, when he brings John back to the world state and is effectively his custodian, he becomes a bit like a celebrity. He invites only the highest ranking people to his parties. Everyone wants to see John, and by extension, everyone wants to see him. He has the attention of attractive women, something he could previously only dream of, and he has the social standing of someone far above even his position. And he loves this. His opinion of the state changes on a whim, and all of a sudden he appreciates what he previously hated. Of course, as soon as his newfound fame evaporates when John refuses to make an appearance at one of his parties, he goes right back to despising this horrible new world. But despite its amusing undertones, I actually think Bernard's experience of shame is very insightful, and it's one of the most underrated aspects of Huxley's novel. In a recent paper, James Lang argued that shame stems from a thwarted desire to connect with other people in a socially acceptable or proper way. So when we are shamed and when we experience shame, we are receiving two distinct messages. The first is that despite our wish to connect, we are not connecting. And secondly, that this is because of some value failing on our part. In other words, we are not just being rejected, but we are being rejected specifically because we are deficient in some way. There are clear cases where we might actually want to communicate this message. We might want to let a mass murderer know that their social rejection is as a direct result of their failure to live up to the moral standards of the community. But if we take Lang's analysis seriously, then we immediately notice two further things. One, shaming only works if someone actually desires to connect with us. And two, shame can bleed into someone's self-conception because we're telling them that they are not only denied connection, but denied it because of something wrong about them specifically. And this is where the unsettling way the controllers use shame in Brave New World comes into focus. There is only one world state and one world culture. Moreover, every child is conditioned from birth to desire socialization and companionship, and to find solitude and quiet reflection incredibly uncomfortable. In other words, the setup is perfect to make shame as painful as possible. Everyone is taught to desire social acceptance and these shallow connections in the extreme. But at the same time, there is only one way to achieve this desire, and if you don't get it that way, then you are permanently isolated and alone. And since the citizens are taught to associate being alone with being deficient, and that only weird people want to spend time with themselves, they conclude that if they are not constantly in the company of others, then there must be something deeply wrong with them. And underneath all of his spite, Bernard thinks this too. Of course, this also means that if the controllers ever wanted to bring someone back from the brink of rebellion, then they could snap their fingers and summon up some social acceptance for them. And they would react exactly how Bernard did. His programming still has a total hold on him, and as soon as the opportunity arises, he leaps back into the arms of the institutions he so hated. This is the existentially terrifying nature of shame. It stokes our desire for acceptance at the very same time it denies it to us. Brave New World communicates just how powerful a form of social control shame can be, and Huxley uses it to great effect in the unsettling dynamics of Bernard's relationships. It also reminds us of the long-lasting effects of rejection. Bernard has faced rejection his entire life, and as a result, he becomes immensely vulnerable to betraying his principles at the first sign of acceptance. By contrast, Helmholtz has always been considered an exceptional and brilliant man, and has only had encouragement wherever he went. So, by the events of the novel, he does not require social acceptance, and this allows him to bear his exile with dignity, while Bernard flies into a frenzy at the thought of losing what little social position he had. But next, we shall move on to Huxley's analysis of a deep and controversial human need, one that we see come up in philosophy quite a lot, but that often goes unacknowledged. 7. The necessity of sacrifice. All through the New Testament of the Bible, we see themes of sacrifice. The most obvious example of this is Christ dying on the cross, and so redeeming all of mankind. But we also see the apostles give up their possessions and their former lives to follow Jesus. St. Paul sacrificed his livelihood to spread the word of God. And the Virgin Mary give up her beloved son for the good of the world. And this is not just a theme in Christian scripture. It appears in Buddhist texts where monastics are instructed to live in service to others, and in the Vedas where rituals of sacrifice are outlined. And this widespread usage of sacrifice as a motif is kind of remarkable, given how potentially unpleasant sacrifice can be. By definition, a sacrifice is the giving up of something good in service to something greater, and that's sort of a tough pill to swallow. But what is perhaps even worse than sacrifice is having nothing we would want to sacrifice for. The philosopher Bernard Williams talks of categorical desires. These are things that we would desire to happen even if we were not around to see them. For instance, I might wish that my siblings achieve success in whatever they do, even if I do not live to see it happen. That would be a categorical desire. But I'm not going to wish that my bacon sandwich tomorrow would still be here, even if I die in the night. Thus, that is not a categorical desire. Intuitively, categorical desires transcend our thoughts about ourselves and our own pleasure, and reach out into the world to imbue an aspect of it with value. It is striving for something greater than ourselves. And according to Williams, categorical desires are a huge part of what makes our lives meaningful. They are what stop our existence from becoming a solipsistic circle jerk, and allows us to value things for their own sake, rather than merely what they can do for us. And the value of this idea seems intimately connected with sacrifice. Having a categorical desire is, in effect, having something outside yourself that you value just as much or more than your own pleasure. It is thus very close to having something worth sacrificing for. And it's a good thing, too. Without these categorical desires, we would have no reason to care about anything whose timeline stretches beyond our own death. Of course, Williams is not the only person whose work is relevant here. If we examine Nietzsche's working definition of meaning, we see it as something like a thing you are willing to act in service to. Or, to stick more closely to his terminology, a higher purpose you are able to sublimate your will to. For him, it is what allows us to transcend short-term hedonism and make our lives not just pleasant, but fulfilling and organized. To bring this idea down to earth, think of the parents you know, and how they say they would not just sacrifice for their child, but do so happily, without a shred of doubt or resentment in their heart, and that they find this fact both comforting and fulfilling. If Nietzsche is to be believed, this is the kind of meaning a sacrificial attitude can imbue us with. And we can see people's willingness and even eagerness to sacrifice quite a lot in everyday life. From the friends giving up a jolly evening to confront a recently bereaved companion, to the child in the playground sharing their favorite toy with their little sister. This sort of sacrificial generosity can make not just the receiver happy, but the giver as well. And this is one of those rare things that Nietzsche, Jesus, the Buddha, Dostoevsky, and Aristotle would all agree on. So it's at the very least worth considering. And part of the reason Brave New World strikes John as a dystopia is because the people there are deprived of having something they can sacrifice for. Behind the vague platitudes about everyone living for everyone else, there are very few examples of genuine sacrifice in the world state. In practice, people simply pursue pleasure and avoid discomfort. If they are sad, they take a soma, and if they feel desire, they just go out and achieve it, without a second thought about anything else. There are certainly strengths in this approach. It's better than a kick in the teeth. but it also seems that we have lost something in the process. One of the clearest examples of this comes in the relationship between John and Lenina. John is clearly attracted to Lenina as she is to him, but he does not want to consummate this until they are in a committed bond. This makes very little sense to Lenina, but to John, the self-denial is the point. He is sacrificing his own short-term pleasure to show his seriousness about making Lenina his wife. Lenina may not understand, but to John, this is a crucial part of love. He is demonstrating his willingness for self-sacrifice. And this same urge to sacrifice is embodied in Helmholtz when he begins to act out against the world state, inserting his own poetry into his lectures on propaganda, despite it being forbidden. Nobody forced him to do this. He wants to sacrifice for his own principles. Otherwise, how does he know he even has them? It is all well and good us saying we would suffer for something, but until we truly do, our modest martyrdom is wholly untested. Helmholtz and John both hold their categorical desires incredibly close to their heart. Additionally, some philosophers like Schopenhauer have argued that our willingness to sacrifice on behalf of others is the very thing that marks us out as ethical people. The willingness to give up some of our pleasure or to feel pain out of compassion for another person is, for him, emblematic of everything a good person should strive to be. But, in their wisdom, the controllers have effectively removed sacrifice. If anyone is unhappy, then they just put them in a drug-fueled mental holiday. And the very act of being invested enough in another person or an idea to sacrifice on their behalf is seen as socially destructive. After all, it is everyone belongs to everyone else, and any deeper level of compassion than the vague goodwill we feel towards our fellow humans runs counter to the maintenance of predictable social order. If someone values something enough to sacrifice for it, then they might even value it more than the orders that come from on high. But if we take philosophers like Bernard Williams and Nietzsche, along with some modern psychologists like Emily Impet, seriously, then we are forced to admit that in eliminating sacrifice, the controllers have also killed off a potentially very fulfilling aspect of people's lives. Deeper meaning has been sacrificed at the altar of shallower pleasure. We never find out how many in Brave New World feel the same sort of emptiness as Helmholtz or Bernard, but I cannot help but think that they must be more common than the likes of Mustafa Mond would want to admit. There may be such a thing as empty pleasure. And now, I want to tackle this point about pleasure head-on, as it truly is the golden thread that runs through the novel's philosophy, and it touches upon a few of the most interesting questions in history. 8. The right to be unhappy. Towards the end of the novel, we witness an extended dialogue between John and Mustafa Mond on the nature and value of pleasure. We've been referencing this through the whole video, but now let's dive a little deeper in order to interrogate the very foundations of the controller's views on good governance and what it means to be a person. As I said before, the thing that sets the government of Brave New World apart from a lot of other dystopias is that they're actually quite good-natured. They profess that they only want what is best for the citizens of the world state, and we have no particular reason to disbelieve them. Furthermore, they work on largely appealing utilitarian premises. They want to maximize happiness and minimize pain, and this seems perfectly noble. But the controllers also make a number of philosophical assumptions that are quite questionable, and we and John can target each one of them. The first is that all pleasures are created equal. Implicit in Mustafa Mond's worldview is that happiness is linear and based on quantity, so no distinction is made between different types of pleasure. The difference between ecstasy, joy, happiness, titillation, soma-fueled mania, and fulfillment is essentially glossed over in favor of a lower-resolution worldview where all of these things are exactly the same, and can be summed together in a hedonic calculus. And funnily enough, this was also a criticism that early utilitarianism encountered. In its initial format, it only talked about pleasure and nothing else, and was accused of being far too simplistic. So John Stuart Mill eventually drew a distinction between the lower pleasures, like eating, drinking, and the physical part of having sex, and the higher pleasures, like companionship, love, and Aristotelian-style contemplation. This is partly the thrust of John's criticisms regarding art. In prioritizing the short-term hedonism of their citizens, the controllers have robbed them of lots of other kinds of positive feeling, like catharsis, or compassion, or deep-seated affection. But John's critique ultimately stretches much deeper than this, because what he wants, as Mustafa puts it, is the right to be unhappy. That is, he wants to feel the full breadth of human experience and places some value on this in itself, rather than simply desiring positive feelings all the time. This reminds me of a paper by Robert Nehmeyer, who argues that grief is partly about establishing the identity of the deceased after their death. In this case, someone might paradoxically feel glad to be grieving, as in doing so they are honouring their beloved dead. Shakespeare once described the sweet sorrow of parting from your lover, knowing that you will see them again and full of present sadness and premeditated joy. The human mind is not as simple as adding up our pleasures and subtracting our pains. According to John, there is value in the push and pull of the pleasant and unpleasant sides of human experience. And if we cut off negativity entirely, then we will be depriving ourselves of the strange satisfaction of having lived a life that was full. There are parallels here with something Nietzsche said about how someone can either be open to the highs and lows of life or neither, but you cannot have one without the other. That is, if you are going to fully engage with the willful and passionate aspects of your life, then sometimes this will take you to a temporary energetic ecstasy, but sometimes it will also plunge you into misery. We can choose to dull both edges of this passion if we like, but for Nietzsche, if we are open to one, then the other will surely occur at some point. Ultimately, this is an empirical claim, and I will leave it up to you to decide how well evidenced it is from your own experiences. John also despises the concept of soma, this drug that can induce happiness in even the most melancholic of patients. It is unlike many modern antidepressants in that it does not have immediate side effects, only shortening the patient's lifespan slightly in the long term. But John still sees its happiness as false in some way. In my video on 1984, I mentioned Robert Nozick's fantastic thought experiment, the experience machine. This was an imagined scenario where he would offer to plug us into a machine that would simulate total bliss for our entire lives. He will even sweeten the deal by wiping our memory, so we won't even know it's a simulation. His contention is that most people will refuse this offer. We would rather experience a true and real mixed bag than a false and simulated paradise. This has been used as evidence that there are some things we humans tend to value more than happiness. Truth being one example of this. But there is another question raised by this experiment. What does it mean for someone's happiness to be false? A soma trip strikes a lot of people as false happiness because it induces a dreamlike state where someone's fantasies play out in front of them. But does that devalue the feeling itself in some way? John and Bernard contend that it does, but it is an open question. Take Linda, for instance, John's traumatized mother who spends her final days high on soma. She was truly miserable, and there seemed to be no way to relieve this misery. Should we really expect her to remain in this world that has done her so much harm, rather than escape into a comforting illusion? And then there are other thinkers who talk about our deep-seated self-destructive drives. Dostoevsky thought that if we perceived ourselves as unfree, then it would not matter how much pleasure we ought to be feeling. We would eventually rebel, wanting to reclaim a sense of our human dignity. This thought was picked up by later psychotherapists and given the startling name death drive, a concept which remains controversial to this day. But whether it is true in general, for John, such a drive very much exists. He would rather be a suffering rebel than a happy conformist. And his impulse to self-destruct is finally fulfilled when he ends his own life in his isolated lighthouse, the scars from his self-flagellation still gleaming on his back. Ultimately, Brave New World challenges a deep-seated assumption that many of us have, that pleasure is always good, and that more pleasure is always better. This may be true or it may be false, and it partly hinges on where exactly we set the boundaries of the term pleasure. For Huxley, the controllers have made the concept far too narrow and traded in our humanity for a cheap thrill. But finally, what is the point of reading a dystopian fiction book from the 1930s in the 21st century? Well, I'm glad you asked. 9. The Warnings of Brave New World. As I said at the beginning of this video, Brave New World is pretty unusual in the genre of dystopian fiction. Rather than depicting outright oppression, it instead portrays a populace too unreflective and filled with short-term hedonism that they cannot see what is potentially wrong with their society. Rather than the brutality of the Pax Romana, it is the gentle distraction of the panem et circenses. Instead of maintenance through military might, it is the manufactured happy consent of the citizenry that keeps the global government afloat. It is not that they have thought about it and decided that this is what they want. It is that it has not even occurred to them to question their situation. And this means Huxley can provide his own unique brand of warning. First, at the personal level, it encourages us to put conscious thought into what matters to us. The citizens of the New World are deliberately conditioned not to value anything more than consumption and pleasure, but we don't have to. We can freely reflect on what fulfillment means to us and to what extent short-term pleasure has a role in it. Beyond that, we can question what hedonism even means for our lives. Do we favour the highs and lows of a more extreme lifestyle, or the Epicurean delights of a conversation with friends over some bread and a glass of wine? We will have inherited a societal idea of what is pleasurable, and Huxley encourages us to interrogate this viciously. Secondly, at the social level, it is worth reflecting on when pleasure becomes a tool that is used to distract us from an issue or question that might be really important to us. Thinkers from the Roman poet Juvenal to Machiavelli have warned us that when push comes to shove, rulers may turn to distraction techniques to sneak through some unpopular decision, or to cover something up. Huxley reminds us that just because we are having a good time now does not mean that all is well, and that distraction is no less diverting because it is pleasant. Thirdly, at the philosophical level, we can begin to ask what things are more valuable than pleasure and how they might factor into both our ethical system and our existential philosophy. Even if you're a die-hard utilitarian, the question of what exactly pleasure amounts to and its relationship to pain, disappointment, excitement, anxiety, fear, elation, anticipation, and more are very much relevant. Beyond this, asking whether pleasures can be empty, or whether some pleasures are more morally important than others, or whether there are some things like freedom or expression or individuality that are far more important than pleasure, can all get our philosophical juices flowing. Again, these are all open questions, but they are profoundly interesting ones, and they can help us gain a more precise understanding into what is perhaps the most important philosophical question of all: how to live a good life. Your answers to these inquiries will help you decide whether Brave New World is a flawed utopia or an outright abomination, trampling over everything that is human in the name of a false mistress. Because, ultimately, what separates Brave New World from its contemporaries like 1984 is the nagging question pervading the whole book. What if the controllers were right? What if pleasure is all there is? And what if the sacrifice of art, freedom, individuality, change, love, class mobility, solitude, and more are all worth it, provided we can get our daily hit of happiness and dream some easy dreams? Mustafa Mond stands in front of us, a modern Mephistopheles with his hand outstretched. But is his bargain worth it? Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. And if you want to see a completely different dystopia, then check out this video, where I look at Orwell's Nightmare, 1984. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.